going to talk about developing that calf from the inside out, and really we're going to just hone in on the rumen development of that calf. And rumen development is very important. It's probably the most important aspect of raising that young newborn calf, second only to the use of colostrum and getting that immune function going. Developing that rumen is key because we are actually taking that newborn calf and developing their gastrointestinal tract to be able to function as a rumen. The rumen development is so important because later we will need that rumen to help promote feed intake, which will translate when she's older into growth as well as milk production. And then also we need that rumen for nutrient digestibility and absorption. Our nature did a wonderful thing in creating it. It has a 4-compartment stomach, just like an adult cow does as well, but it looks very different than it would 2 years later. Her rumen is only about 30% of the total volume of the stomach area as compared to 85% of the stomach area in an adult cow. For that newborn calf, the true stomach, or the abomasum, comprises the largest part of the stomach area, and that's where the digestion occurs. And as we develop that rumen, we kind of switch it over where the rumen becomes the main digestive factory for the cow. So the pre-ruminant phase, again, this is a calf from about 0 to 3 weeks of age. And at this point, she has a non-functional rumen. Her abomasum is the main compartment of her stomach that is functioning and makes her function more like a monogastric animal, like you or I or pigs, the simple stomached animals, where we have acid digestion. And at this time, its milk is the main feed ingredient that is digested by the abomasum. And the longer that we do not offer dry feed, the longer it takes for that rumen to develop. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here shortly. So these are images from Dr. Judd Hendricks out of Penn State. And really, what's really key is developing that rumen lining. And we've heard of rumen papillae. And if you look at the image on the left, we could see an undeveloped rumen lining. So there along the, held up by the hand, we see it's very smooth and the surface area is not as great. And then if we look to the image on the right, we could see here where it's a developed rumen lining that we start seeing these papillae, these projections sticking out, giving us more surface area for absorption of nutrients. And this papillae, this rumen development, allows that calf to be able to digest and absorb nutrients later on in life. And when we get to the cow, we really want to develop that rumen so that we really have this nice, beautiful, I call it a carpet, but finger-like projections of papillae that we allow us to absorb those nutrients once it's digested in the rumen. We also have, a reticulum as well as the omasum. And then again, we still have the abomasum, or the simple stomach or true stomach of the animal. But this is where we're focusing on today. And as caretakers of our pre-weaned calves, this is our goal, is to have this rumen lining development so that we can switch it from a non-functioning ruminant to a functioning ruminant. So that process, when it comes to rumen development, really has 5 key ingredients. It's the starch, or the grain, the starter. It's liquid from water, bacteria, muscular movement of the rumen, and the absorptive ability for the rumen lining. Now, again, when we think about the inside of the digestive system of the newborn calf, as we see here, that this is the lining of the true stomach, or the abomasum. It's very smooth. This is acid digestion that occurs here, just like you or I. And when we feed a liquid feed or milk to that calf, it comes down the esophagus and then bypasses the rumen area, bypasses via the esophageal groove directly into the abomasum. And this is where the liquid feed then is digested and then later absorbed for energy, and is the main energy supplier for the calf until that rumen is developed. And as we develop that digestive system of that calf, That occurs about the first 4 to 8 weeks of life. And as you can see, 4 to 8 weeks of life really coincides with the time we typically wean her off of liquid feed. One of the key things we want to remember about developing the digestive system, that it's a chemical process. It's not a physical process. We actually have some chemistry in line that really causes the change that we want to occur in the rumen lining. And just mentioned earlier, the energy and protein needs of that newborn calf or the pre-weaned calf is derived from the intestinal digestion of the liquid feed or the milk. And once we start giving that calf water and starter and they begin consuming it, we really start initiating that rumen development. So it's really key to start giving starter within the first couple of days of life. Here's another image out of Penn State looking at the rumen lining. And again, if we look at A and B, that's the rumen lining of a calf that has not had any grain. The first one is with a milk only diet. And then B is a milk and hay diet. And then when we look at C, we have a starter diet with milk and hay. And as you can see, it's really the starter, the starch, the carbohydrates, and then again, the byproducts of fermentation of those byproducts or the digestion of those products that really help that rumen development. And it's a chemical process. It's not the scratch factor as people once believed from the hay. It's actually the chemical process and absorption of some major nutrients. So when we look at the digestive system, we're really looking at the transition phase from 4 to 8 weeks of age. So 0 to 3 weeks of age, they really don't have a functioning rumen. And as we introduce starter and water and eventually bacteria, then we start seeing changes in the rumen lining. And hopefully that our rumen becomes the main digestion site and begins growing in size in proportion to the abomasum. And at this time, we want to see the growth of papillae and the rumen lining that will eventually help it be able to digest and absorb many of the nutrients that are produced from the digestion in the rumen. And this really occurs from starch, from the breakdown of the starch grain into the volatile fatty acids of butyrate, propionate, and acetate. So again, the availability of feedstuff is key in initiating rumen development. We want to offer clean, fresh calf starter about day 3. And when we offer fresh calf starter, initially, we don't want to give it a whole bucket because that would be wasteful, but giving it a handful or a couple of handfuls and then gradually building that up so that we can introduce the calf starter to the calf and they'll start nibbling. So any little bit of starter that we can get into the calf will help initiate rumen development where then they'll start intaking more. We want to make sure that our starter meets the NRC recommendations, and as with any creature, even us, palatability is key for the consumption or starter. Now again, what about hay? And when we talked a little bit about the acetate, propionate, and butyrate, which are volatile fatty acids from the digestion of starter, the digestion of hay provides acetic acid or acetate. And this acetic acid is less crucial for rumen development. And we can see here on images again from Penn State University on the left that looking at the rumen, which is on the right side of the picture, a calf at 4 weeks of age fed milk, grain, and hay has more projections or papillae development than the calf at the same age that was only fed milk and hay. So again, it's not necessarily the scratch factor that hay provides to promote healthy growth of papillae. It's acetate, volatile fatty acid, but again, the acetate does not provide enough energy for the rumen development. So when we look at hay, this is why we want to offer it after weaning to give time for that rumen papillae to develop into where we can be able to digest hay, ferment it, digest it, and absorb those nutrients. And we know this is chemical and not a physical process. So research here shown Jim Quigley out of Calf Notes in 1999 looked at the different types of materials or metabolites that can be used to promote rumen development. And he showed that it's stimulated by volatile fatty acids, the butyrate, the propionate, the byproducts of grain digestion. It is not the scratch factors people once years ago believed. And when we look at the chart, we could see that milk's development on the rumen provides some. The volatile fatty acids, mainly butyrate and propionate, are key, the material that provides rumen development. Grain, obviously, when we digest grain, butyrate and propionate are some of the end products and will help promote rumen development. When we digest hay, acetate is the main volatile fatty acid produced from that digestion. So we see that propionate and butyrate are higher on rumen development, and therefore we want to make sure we have grain versus hay. When we put in other types of particles or sponges to help give the scratch factor, really there was no impact on rumen development. So when we look at this, it's really about our volatile fatty acids, the end products of grain or starch digestion. And another image to show you here, this is a calf, a veal calf that we provided the stomach from, the 4-compartment stomach. And as we can see here in the lower part of the slide on the left, this is the rumen, and then the size of it in proximity to the abomasum, the reticulum, and the omasum. We could see that, it does have a large amount of volume compared to the other 3 compartments. And then we could see that mainly it's a milk digestion here that we see in the rumen that eventually bypassed the stomach, but actually went into the rumen. And then when we look at this later on, we'll see a couple more slides here. As compared to a calf the same age on a grain diet, and we could see that there's some hay in here as well, we could see that the rumen is substantially larger than the other 3 compartments of the stomach. This is because we're expanding, we're growing that, giving it some depth. And then you could see, looking on the inside of this rumen, that we could see here, not very well, but we could see that there's some projection, like finger-like projections here compared to the all milk diet calf. So liquid in the rumen is one of the key things we need to have, and it's really liquid from water, because a lot of times that milk bypasses the rumen and goes straight into the abomasum due to the esophageal groove. Now, a little milk will flow over to the rumen, which is great, but really water is the main source because that goes directly into the rumen. And we want to be offering water shortly after birth, because we see here, based on Kurtz in 1984, that we increase some weight gains. Calves that had free choice water had 0.6 pounds per gain per day versus no water at 0.4 pounds per gain per day. We actually increased starter intake, which is huge because starter is really the key ingredient into rumen development. And then we also saw less days of scours on those animals. 2000, Jim Quigley shows that the water intake versus starter consumption, as we increase the amount of water to our calves, that the starter intake actually increases in proportion. So key again is to help promote that starter intake, we want to have accessible, clean, fresh water. And why do we need to have this water in the rumen? It provides that wonderful environment for rapid bacterial growth. Milk does not provide enough liquid because it bypasses the rumen and goes into the abomasum. However, even small amounts will help promote bacterial growth in the rumen. But again, that major source of liquid in the rumen for rumen development is actually from water. Now, when we have our starch in there and we have our water to digest these feeds, we really need to have bacteria in the rumen. And at birth, it is non-existent in the rumen. And as caretakers and as nature, it's our role to provide that bacteria. And really that bacteria is introduced in the rumen at the time that calf starts to consume calf starter or starts nibbling and suckling on other things in its environment, ingesting some of that bacteria, that good bacteria from its environment. And we need that bacteria because it helps with the digestion process, and again, helps with the end products that causes the changes in the rumen lining. So it's really key to have bacteria here, and then eventually this bacteria will be then harvested, if you want to use that word, or metabolized by actually the rumen to be microbial protein once she begins older and becomes a functioning rumen. And when we look at bacteria fermentation, again, going back over the volatile fatty acids, that's what we really need from all of this, from the process, is that volatile fatty acid, which comes from bacteria digesting the feed in the rumen. And again, acetate becomes from fiber sources. Butyrate and propionate, the two key volatile fatty acids we need, are from starch and sugar sources. So again, our starter that will be key in helping create those volatile fatty acids for rumen development. And again, when we look at this rumen development, we're going to have this starch, this grain that's ingested and is in the rumen. And as bacteria begins to digest this starch, we have end products of propionate, butyrate, and acetate. And it is through the absorption of these three volatile fatty acids, or VFAs, more so with butyrate, that we see and start that change of that rumen lining to the papillae, having the rumen lining being from smooth and developing slowly over time to finger-like projections or papillae to give it more surface area and be able to absorb more nutrients. And as the rumen changes and it develops more of a lining, we become a functional rumen, the abomasum no longer becomes the main source of energy absorption. The energy source will eventually take over by the rumen and then absorbed into the bloodstream of the animal. And developing this rumen really is about helping that animal be able to digest forages, fiber, feed products that we as monogastrics cannot digest, and turning it into a product that we can, such as milk or meat. So again, looking at the papillae, which one would you prefer? Would you want the heads, which is on the left, or the tails, which is on the right? Again, if you recall those two images I showed you of a calf fed a all milk diet or veal calf versus a grain diet, we could see that these are the rumen linings from those two animals. And we could see here again, this is kind of what we want to have. This is, I call it kind of like a little carpet, a lot of finger-like projections, increases the surface area to allow for absorption of those metabolites, a lot of that energy and the nutrients that we need. Here, there's not much. You could see some development starting of finger-like projections, but really for the most part, pretty smooth. Doesn't provide the surface area we need. This seems a lot healthier looking in color. Can't explain that, but these calves are both the same age. One was was a veal calf versus one was our traditional dairy calf diets. Another key thing when we talk about rumen development is we need some muscular movement. And when we have muscular movement, just like we do in the milk cow, that rumen, the muscles are churning over the feed, mixing the liquid, the starch, the bacteria, so that we can have that digestion occur. And also we need that muscular movement to help move feed stuff through the gastrointestinal tract further down through the small intestine. Now we have several types of movement. We have rumen pressure, pushing on the feed, rumen contractions, as well as cud chewing, which helps with movement, swirling, mixing that feed. Now, at the time of birth, because again, we don't really have a functional rumen, there's really little activity in that rumen at the time. And again, as we slowly develop that rumen lining and those muscles start growing, then we really start building that muscular movement. And as feed intake increases, so do those contractions in the rumen. We need absorption as well. So we're really doing a lot to this animal in a very short amount of time. And when we think about the layers of the rumen, there's two layers. One is muscular, which helps with the contractions, the mixing of the feed with the liquid and the bacteria, as well as moving it down the GI tract. But we also have an epithelial layer, which does the absorption of the nutrients. So at birth, just like with the muscular layer, that there's no muscular movement or contractions at time of birth, the epithelial layer really doesn't have the ability to absorb nutrients yet. The volatile fatty acids, the butyrate and the propionate that are created from the digestion of the starter, stimulates that growth, which then elongates those finger-like projections, those papillae, so that we can start having more surface area and more nutrients absorbed. When we don't have proper rumen development, we do put some nutritional stress on our calves. It's more difficult to wean them. We could see at least a month slowdown in growth for those calves, a month behind because of the lack of rumen development and getting them off of liquid feed. And then obviously with nutritional stress, we can possibly see some immune function decreases as well. And with that improper rumen development, it becomes more costly to raise this calf because the liquid feed is more costly than our starter for many individuals who are still using milk replacer. And when we think about improper rumen development or limited rumen development, one of the things we want to just touch briefly on is acidosis. Now, calf acidosis is not the same as a cow acidosis, and defined by some students with Dr. Judd Hendricks in 2016. Calf acidosis, some of those signs include being lethargic, anorexic, having some abdominal discomfort, or maybe they're kicking at their sides, and lack of rumen motility. And a lot of those, the rumen motility, really coincides with rumen development. And we can see this calf acidosis in cows 4 to 6 hours post-feeding. And why do we see that? What happens in the calf if the rumen isn't developed properly and we give that calf a lot of grain, what happens is that starch, the calf consumes a lot of that feed, and then it digests it. We have a lot of butyrate and a lot of propionate floating here in the rumen. And if that rumen is not properly developed where it can absorb all of that volatile fatty acids through the lining, we have a buildup of the acid, a low decrease in pH, a buildup of these 2 acids or potentially 3 acids. So therefore, they become discomfort, and that happens 4 to 6 hours. So not walkthroughs just every 12 hours, but observing your calves, looking for signs of discomfort can help give you an idea if we have good rumen development or not. Because if they can't absorb when they're older calves, when they look like they should be consuming large amounts of grain because they are larger, if that rumen isn't developed or on track, they're going to have a buildup of these acids, which then causes the acidosis. Judd Hendricks had mentioned that if we have issues of acidosis due to the grain, even feeding high quality forages to kind of reduce the amount of those particular acids and more acetate would be key as well. So when we think about weaning calves, being mindful of rumen development, really it's intake base. And we want to have calves taking in grain starting as early as 3 days of age, even if it's a handful of grain to help initiate and start that rumen development. Because by the time we wean her in 8 weeks, we want her to have a functioning rumen so that we can wean her off of milk and most of her energy and dietary needs are being absorbed through the rumen. We want substantial grain intake by 3 weeks of age, at least half a pound of feed grain per day. And then by the time we wean her, we want at least 1 pound of grain per day or more, 21 to 28 days leading up to weaning. And again, thinking about the acidosis, we talk about 2 to 3 pounds of grain per day for 2 to 3 days consistently when we wean. That seemed to be the magic number. But they can still consume 2 to 3 pounds of grain per day when they're older animals with a larger stomach, that we may have problems with acidosis or other issues because we're not fully developing the rumen. So making sure they're intaking grain 3 to 4 weeks before weaning is key, because we want to make sure that rumen papillae is developed, elongated, can absorb those nutrients, and we don't have a buildup of some of those volatile fatty acids. And then finally, when we wean them, again, intake based, they're eating enough grain and starter so that most of their energy needs are coming from that and not the liquid feed. We want to gradually wean them off of milk, 5 to 7 days, step down so that it's not abrupt and causing some weaning stress. So again, I went through that very quickly with rumen development, but the most important aspect of raising a dairy calf behind colostrum management, making sure we develop that immune system, is really developing that rumen. Without developing that rumen, it increased our costs in the fact that we're feeding more liquid milk or liquid feed instead of starter. We really don't have a solid foundation for this animal to start intaking forages. And then we see some slow in growth, which then kind of impacts the heifer maturity that Matt has spoke to previously. And that, we have later days at first breeding, which then translate to later days at first calving, meaning we don't see income from her until after, or potentially delayed because that we're not providing a solid foundation. So again, that was just quickly about developing the calf from the inside out, looking at that rumen development. And the key takeaways is, again, that it is very important getting the starter in the calf to have volatile fatty acids from grain digestion to help the lining of that rumen develop those finger-like papillae projections, so that eventually when she is weaned, she can start consuming forages and be able to be a productive member in the herd.